The morning she drove the first fence post into my ground. She had no idea she was signing her own resignation letter. I have lived on this property for 11 years. 11 years of quiet mornings with coffee on the back porch, watching the mist roll off the creek that runs along the eastern edge of my land. 11 years of mowing my own grass, maintaining my own tree line, paying my own taxes on every square foot of these 3 acres. I know this land the way some people know the backs of their hands better. Maybe. I have walked every boundary line. I have stood at every corner marker. I have read the survey documents so many times, the paper has grown soft along the fold lines. So when I tell you I knew exactly where my property ended and where the neighborhood common area began, I want you to understand that this was not a guess. This was not a misunderstanding on my part. This was certainty. My name is Daniel Mercer. I moved to Briarwood Estates in the spring of my 38th year, young enough to still be optimistic about neighbors, old enough to know that communities run on unspoken rules as much as written ones. The neighborhood is a quiet stretch of half-acre lots and a handful of larger parcels like mine, tucked behind a stone entrance gate and a set of CC&Rs that most people only glance at before signing. I had read mine cover to cover, twice. I am that kind of person. For most of those 11 years, life here was exactly what I had hoped for. Cookouts in summer, a wave from across the yard, the occasional dispute about leaf blowers before 8 in the morning, settled with a polite knock and a coffee-fueled conversation. Normal, decent, neighborhood life. Then Patricia Holden became president of the Briarwood Homeowners Association. Patricia moved in 3 years ago, and within 6 months she had attended every HOA meeting, volunteered for every committee, and positioned herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed conscience. She was the kind of woman who smiled with her mouth and watched with her eyes, always calculating, always measuring, always finding the millimeter where your lawn edging fell short of acceptable. She drove a white SUV that she parked at slightly inconvenient angles, as if the rules of the parking lot applied to everyone but her. She wore her HOA precedent lanyard to outdoor events that had nothing to do with the HOA. She had opinions about your mailbox flag. I had managed to stay mostly off her radar by simply keeping my property immaculate. My fence lines were clean. My grass was trimmed. My driveway was sealed. I gave her nothing to work with, and so she left me alone, or so I believed. The trouble started in early April, when the association decided it wanted to install a new privacy fence along the western border of the neighborhood common area. A reasonable enough project on its face. The problem, as I would soon discover, was that Patricia had interpreted the boundary line using an outdated plat map from 1987, one that had since been corrected by a professional resurvey conducted in 2003, a survey that moved the property line nearly 14 feet east of where the old document showed it to be. 14 feet. On 3 acres. That's not a rounding error. That's a strip of land that contains part of my creekside buffer. 3 mature oak trees I planted myself, and approximately 40 linear feet of my irrigated garden bed. She didn't ask me about it. She didn't knock on my door. She didn't send a letter. One Tuesday morning, I looked out my kitchen window with my coffee in hand, and I watched a 2-man crew from a local fencing company begin driving steel posts into the earth that belonged to me. I set my mug down slowly. I took one long breath, and I thought to myself, she has no idea what she just started. I walked out my back door calmly. I want to be clear about that. I was calm. My pulse was steady, my voice was level, and I had put on shoes before I came outside, which felt like an important choice in retrospect. I crossed my yard at a measured pace, and when I reached the crew, I raised one hand in a friendly enough wave and introduced myself. Morn, I said, I'm Daniel Mercer. I own this parcel. Can I ask who contracted this work? The older of the 2 workers, a sun-weathered man in a green company polo, looked up from the post hole digger and exchanged a quick glance with his partner. HOA hired us, he said simply. Ms. Holden placed the order. I appreciate that, I said, but I need you to stop for a moment. But those posts are going into my property. I've got a surveyed boundary and I think there's been a mistake. He looked at the ground, then back at me. He wasn't unfriendly, just uncertain. We're working off the site plan they gave us, he said. I understand, I told him. I'm not upset with you, but I'd ask you to pause until we can get this sorted out. If there's a boundary dispute, your company could be liable too. That last sentence landed. The older worker pulled out his phone and stepped away to make a call. Within 20 minutes, they had packed up their equipment and left. I stood at the edge of my property and looked at the 2 post holes already dug, 2 ugly wounds in the earth beside my oaks. And I felt the first real heat of anger move through me before I pressed it back down. I was going to need to be precise about this. Emotional wouldn't serve me. Patricia arrived 45 minutes later. I heard her car before I saw her. The crunch of gravel on the access path that runs along the common area, moving faster than the path warranted. She stepped out of her white SUV, wearing sunglasses she didn't take off, a pressed blouse, and the lanyard. Always the lanyard. Mr. Mercer, she said, walking toward me with the particular stride of someone who has confused confidence with authority. "I understand you stopped my crew." "I asked them to pause," I said. "There's a boundary issue." She tilted her head slightly to the right, the way someone does when they've already decided not to listen to you. "The fence placement was approved by the full HOA board and is based on the recorded plat for Briarwood Estates. I assure you the boundaries are correct." "They're not," I said. I kept my voice even. "The plat you're using predates a professional resurvey done in 2003. The corrected survey is on file with the county. The line is 14 feet east of where you're placing that fence." The sunglasses didn't move. "I've reviewed the documents thoroughly, Mr. Mercer. The association has been quite careful about this. I'd like to show you the survey," I said. "It won't be necessary." She turned back toward her vehicle. I watched her go. "Patricia," I said, "just loud enough." She stopped but didn't turn around. "If that fence goes up on my land, I will pursue every legal remedy available to me. I want you to hear that clearly." She got in her car and drove away without responding. I went inside and called a real estate attorney that same afternoon. But what followed over the next 3 weeks was a campaign of pressure that I can only describe as sustained and deliberate. First came the HOA letter, a formal notice of alleged violation, sent certified mail, claiming that my creekside garden bed extended into the common area and that I had 7 days to remove it or face daily fines of $50. I read it twice, photographed it, and filed it in the folder. I had already started labeling Holden. Then came the second letter, this one citing an alleged violation of the fence ordinance. Ironic, given the circumstances, claiming that a retaining wall I had built along the garden 3 years prior had not received proper HOA approval. My HOA approval letter from that project was dated June 14th, 2021. I found it in under 4 minutes. I added it to the folder. The third contact was not a letter. It was Patricia herself, standing at my front door on a Wednesday evening, clipboard in hand, with a woman I vaguely recognized as the HOA secretary standing a half step behind her, like a reluctant witness. I opened the door before she could knock a second time. "Mr. Mercer," she began, her voice carrying the rehearsed gravity of someone who had practiced this conversation. "The board has convened a special session regarding ongoing violations on your parcel. We are prepared to escalate to the association's legal counsel if you continue to obstruct the approved fencing project." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, very quietly, "Would you like to come inside and look at the survey together?" She stiffened. "That won't be necessary," I finished. "Yes, you've said that." The secretary shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Patricia's jaw moved slightly, the way it does when someone is deciding whether to be angrier or more careful. "The crew resumes Friday," she said. "I would advise you not to interfere." "And I would advise you," I said, "to speak with a licensed surveyor before Friday." I closed the door. I leaned against the hallway wall in the quiet of my house and breathed. The folder on my kitchen counter had grown thick. My attorney had already sent a cease and desist to the HOA the previous week. Patricia had responded through the association's counsel, claiming the survey I referenced was not the controlling document. My attorney had laughed at that, in a dry, professional sort of way, that I found more reassuring than any amount of shouting could have been. Friday came, so did the crew, and so did Patricia, parked at the edge of the access path in her white SUV, watching from behind her sunglasses as the workers unloaded their equipment. I was standing at my property line when they arrived. I had a copy of the 2003 survey in my hand, marked up with red lines. I had my attorney on speed dial, and I had arranged for one other thing, something Patricia did not know about yet. I was going to change the process where a licensed professional physically marks the legal property lines using the most current recorded documents. It is not cheap, it is not fast, but it is, in every legal sense, final. The county had assigned a surveyor named Marcus Webb, a compact, methodical man in his early 50s who wore wear-rimmed glasses and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 30 years being the last word on where things stood. He stepped out of his truck, nodded at me, and began setting up his equipment without ceremony. Patricia got out of her SUV. She walked toward us with the clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield, and I could tell the moment she registered what she was seeing because her stride shortened slightly, just a fraction, before she corrected it and kept coming. "What is this?" she said, directing the question somewhere between Marcus and me. "Good morning," I said. "This is Marcus Webb from the county surveyor's office. He's here to establish the legal boundary line for this parcel." She looked at Marcus. He didn't look up from his instrument. "The boundary is already established," she said. "The plat, ma'am," Marcus said, without lifting his eyes. "If you could step back from the instrument, I'd appreciate it." She stepped back. I watched something shift in her expression. Not doubt, not yet, but the first small crack in the wall of certainty she had built. Marcus worked for the better part of an hour. He moved along the line with a methodical patience that felt almost meditative, setting pins, taking readings, consulting his documents, marking stakes with orange flags. Patricia stood at a distance and watched. The fencing crew stood beside their truck and waited, having apparently learned from our first encounter to stay neutral until the geometry was resolved. When Marcus finally drove the last stake and straightened up, he walked the line from east to west one more time, examining each flag. Then he came to stand beside me and looked at Patricia. "The legal boundary for this parcel," he said, "as established by the 2003 resurvey filed with the county and recorded in Plat Book 47, page 112, runs here." He gestured along the line of orange flags. "The proposed fence installation, based on the site plan I was provided, would place the structure approximately 13 feet and 8 inches inside the Mercer property." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Not the ordinary silence of a pause in conversation, but the specific silence of a person whose entire architecture of certainty has just been removed from beneath them. Patricia's mouth opened slightly, then closed. "That," she began. "That can't be right. The 2003 survey supersedes the 1987 plat," Marquez said. He said it without inflection, without satisfaction, the way a calculator displays a number. "The county record is clear. The controlling document is the resurvey. I was told the 1987 plat was—" "Whoever told you that was incorrect," Marcus said simply. I had not planned to say anything in that moment. I had promised myself I would let the facts do the speaking. But I looked at Patricia standing there in her pressed blouse and her lanyard, clipboard limp at her side, sunglasses finally off as if the gesture had become involuntary, and I said, very quietly, "I tried to show you the survey." She turned her face slightly away from me. Her jaw was tight. The secretary, who had arrived at some point in the last hour and was standing near the SUV, had gone absolutely still. What happened next was not something I had arranged, but it felt, in retrospect, inevitable. The HOA legal counsel had apparently been notified of the surveyor's visit by someone on the board, not Patricia, and a man named Gerald Fossey arrived in a gray sedan just as Marcus was photographing the final stake placement. Gerald was a compact, cautious man who represented the association in routine matters, and he walked the line of orange flags with Marcus while I watched from a few feet away. I heard Gerald say, in a low voice, "Is this recorded at the county?" Marcus confirmed it was. Gerald asked him when it had been filed. Marcus said 2003. Gerald nodded slowly, the nod of a man quietly calculating the liability of everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. Gerald turned to Patricia. "The fence cannot go up," he said. "Gerald, Patricia?" His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "The fence cannot go up." She looked at the orange flags. She looked at me. She looked at the 2 post holes still visible in the ground from the earlier attempt to gash us in the earth on my side of the line, my soil, my land, and I watched the moment her composure finally cracked, not into anger, but into something smaller and more brittle. Her chin dropped a fraction of an inch. "What about the violations?" she said, and her voice had lost its official weight. "We'll need to review all of that," Gerald said carefully. Marcus Webb packed up his equipment, shook my hand, and drove away. The fencing crew loaded their truck and left without a word. Gerald spoke quietly with Patricia for several minutes, while I stood at the edge of my garden bed among my oak trees and looked at the orange flags, running along the true and legal and always correct boundary of my land. Then I went inside and called my attorney. The HOA board held an emergency session. 4 days later, I was not invited, but Gerald Fossey had, through my attorney, provided the board with a full accounting of what had occurred, the boundary error, the formal determination, the cease and desist that had been ignored, and the 2 unauthorized post holes that had been dug on my property during the initial attempt. My attorney had also submitted a formal demand for remediation. The post holes filled and restored, 3 weeks of HOA violation, letters formally withdrawn and removed from my record, and a written acknowledgement from the board that the 2003 survey constituted the controlling boundary document for all future association decisions affecting my parcel. The board agreed to all of it within 48 hours. I learned later, through the kind of quiet neighborhood communication that flows through backyard conversations and carefully worded texts, that the meeting had not been comfortable for Patricia. Several board members had apparently been unaware of the extent to which she had pushed forward with the fence project after receiving my attorney's initial cease and desist. One member, a retired contractor named Howard, had reportedly asked Patricia directly whether she had ever personally reviewed the 2003 survey before authorizing the crew. The silence that followed that question told its own story. Patricia stepped down as HOA president 11 days after the surveyor's visit. The announcement came through the standard email newsletter in careful, bloodless language about personal commitments and the time demands of leadership. There was a brief note of thanks for her service. Nothing more. The kind of exit statement that everyone in the neighborhood understood and no one would say out loud. She did not come to my door to apologize. I did not expect her to. Well, she did. And I noticed this in the way you notice small things when you have been watching carefully for a long time. was stopped parking in the access path beside the common area. The white SUV no longer appeared at neighborhood events with the lanyard hanging from the rearview mirror. In the weeks that followed, when I happened to see Patricia across the yard or at the mailbox, she looked at a point roughly 6 inches to my left and kept walking. I made no effort to intercept her. We had said everything that needed to be said, mostly without words. The post holes were filled by a landscaping crew the HOA dispatched the following Saturday. They did a reasonable job, raked the soil, pressed it flat, laid a strip of sod. By the following spring, you would never have known anything had been disturbed. My garden bed bloomed exactly as it always had, right up to the orange survey flag I left in place for another 2 months before quietly removing it. I knew where the line was. I no longer needed to prove it. My attorney filed the paperwork to have all 3 violation notices formally expunged from the HOA record. I received written confirmation of that in a letter signed by the new interim president, a soft-spoken man named Arthur, who had apparently been trying to moderate Patricia's impulses for months and had simply lacked the standing to do so. He called me to introduce himself after the paperwork was complete, and we spoke for about 15 minutes. He was reasonable, measured, and plainly exhausted. I told him I bore no ill will toward the association, only toward the specific pattern of conduct that had brought us to this point. He said he understood. I think he meant it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after sustained conflict, not the exhaustion of having fought, but of having held yourself together through someone else's relentless pressure. For 3 weeks I had absorbed letters, threats, and confrontations while staying disciplined and methodical. And when it was finally over, when the folder on my kitchen counter could be closed and filed instead of added to, I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee and felt the weight of it leave me all at once. It was a mild evening, the creek running quietly to the east, the oaks standing where they had always stood, on my land, in my care, exactly where the survey said they were. I thought about what it costs a person to need control the way Patricia needed it. The energy required to maintain that kind of vigilance, to monitor the neighbors, to drive the stakes, to send the letters, to stand at someone's door with a clipboard and a certainty that was built on nothing more than an outdated piece of paper. I didn't feel triumphant about what had happened to her. I felt something closer to tired on her behalf. But I also felt something else, a quiet, grounded satisfaction that I think is the proper response to justice when it arrives the way it's supposed to, not with noise and drama, but with a licensed surveyor and orange flags and the recorded county documents that were always true, always accessible, always waiting for someone to pay enough attention to look. 3 acres is not a fortune. It is not a sprawling estate, but it is mine, paid for, surveyed, documented, and defended. I earned the right to know every inch of it, and I used that knowledge precisely when it mattered most. Nobody gave me that. I built it through 11 years of quiet, careful attention to the facts. The fence, in the end, was never built. My oaks are still standing. My garden is still growing. The creek still runs in the morning when I bring my coffee outside. And the boundary line is exactly where it has always been, 14 feet east of where Patricia Holden tried to put her fence, and exactly where Marcus Webb's orange flag said it was. Some people learn their lessons loudly, some learn them quietly. Either way, the land doesn't move.